And it probably also reflects, for whatever reason, a relatively low level of national saving in the Latin American region. And other people will be able to speak to that better than I. There is a possibility that low saving might be linked to fairly generous public pension programs, but that's just speculation. Why would this be? Because if you're expecting to be supported by a generous public pension program, then you don't need to save so much during your working years to provide for your own retirement. So savings money. Okay, individual consumption now. Well, again, the black line is the average for the 9 Latin American countries, and the individual lines. But here you see there's a much broader scatter around the mean than there was in the case of labor income. So let's look at some of the countries. I won't try to identify the individual countries here now, but consumption is relatively high. So already in Latin America, consumption is high compared to labor income, but in Brazil and Mexico, it's even higher within the regional context, particularly Mexico, which is a sort of puzzle. I've been trying to understand why this is, how it's being paid for, and so on, and I still don't quite understand. And Brazil is the other country in this region which stands out for having relatively high consumption. And you also see that in Brazil there's some tendency for consumption to rise with age, but it's not so strongly pronounced. In 1996, it was a very powerful age pattern with consumption in Brazil rising strongly with age. Now it's not so different than the other Latin American countries in terms of this age pattern. In Uruguay, Colombia, and Jamaica, consumption tends to be below the Latin American regional average. Perhaps it's more like the global poor country average in that regard. Costa Rica is an interesting case. Did I see Luis here? Yeah, okay. So Costa Rica is interesting, and we see this age pattern in which these cohorts are very disadvantaged. And so I note, quoting from the NTA book that recently appeared, Luis suggests this may be an echo of the economic crisis of the early 1980s. And that reminds us that economic crises such as the one we're in now can have long-term effects, particularly for people who were young at the time of the crisis. They may get less education, as seems to have been the case in Costa Rica, and there may be long-term effects on the earning prospects and economic prospects. Okay, now if we subtract labor income from consumption, then we have what we call the life cycle deficit. How much of what you consume is not paid for by your labor income. So this is a big positive number for children because they consume more than they earn. It's a big positive number for the elderly. It's a negative number for those in the prime working ages where they're producing more than they consume. And then somehow income is being transferred from the surplus produced in these ages to the younger and older workers, people. Now, we see here that in the rich countries, the life cycle deficit is greatest for children, and we see the same thing for the elderly. And in poor countries, it's somewhat less. And we also see that during the working years in the rich countries, there's somewhat more surplus generated and transferred through taxes and through family transfers to other age groups. What is striking about Latin America here is that relatively little surplus is generated, and the width of the age interval in which people are consuming less than their labor income is narrow compared to other countries. So in rich and poor countries, this span is going roughly from age 25 to 60. In Latin America, it's going roughly from, say, 26 to 54 or 55. That goes with the fact that consumption is higher. If consumption were lower, then it would look like these other regions, but it's higher for whatever reason. I don't have a good explanation. Okay. Now we move to support ratios. We want to combine what I was saying about the demographic transition between age distributions with what I've just been saying about the age patterns of consumption and labor income. So we want to see how changing population age distribution affects the economy. And we do that by holding those age profiles that we were just looking at constant, holding them fixed, but letting the population age distribution vary. So, for example, we will see in a very young population, there'll be a lot of people down here, a sort of medium number of people here, and few people up here. And in a very old population, there will be few people here, medium people here, and a lot of people here. And of course, there are intermediate possibilities where there are many people here, and few here, and few here. That is the demographic dividend phase. Okay, so we're going to calculate effective labor by multiplying the population age distribution of whatever year times the age profile of labor income, and we'll divide that by effective consumers by multiplying population age distribution times the consumption age distribution and adding it up. And that ratio is the support ratio. If that ratio is high, it means there are many income earners per consumer. If it's low, that means there are few income earners per consumer. And other things equal, consumption will just be proportional to that support ratio. So here, continuing with the Mexican example, and now just looking at 1950 to 2100, we see how the support ratio would change if the age profiles of today were the same ones that existed back in 1950 or 2050 or whatever. Well, that assumption is bound to be wrong, but still it's useful to do this calculation. So we see the support ratio dropping. This is the same as the youth dependency ratio rising that we saw earlier. Here is the period of rising support ratios. This is the first dividend phase. This adds, on average, 0.7% per year to the growth rate of consumption per equivalent consumer. And then that's followed by a period of population aging, which goes on for, say, something like 35 years. And this will subtract 0.4% per year from consumption per capita growth. And the difference then between this period when the demographic change is very favorable and this period when it's unfavorable, that difference is a bit more than 1% per year. So it's not enormous, but it is large enough to be significant, particularly if the rate of economic growth slows down somewhat, productivity growth slows down somewhat, then these age distributional factors will become increasingly important, as is the case in the rich industrial countries today. Here are some other Latin American countries. Mexico is what we were just looking at. Brazil is, can't see it that well, is this line here. And we have Chile, Costa Rica, and Uruguay. Now, Uruguay here is one of these discrepant countries. It does not conform to the classic demographic transition. It had a fertility transition in 1900. It started. Chile, Cuba, some other country I'm not remembering now had these. Argentina also, I guess, had a very early fertility transition, and so they just look different. But you can see a lot of similarity among the other Latin American countries shown here. And Brazil, let's see. Well, okay, so here is this first dividend phase, which and here is the aging phase, and on average, except for Uruguay, the first dividend phase is adding 0.5 to 0.75% per year to consumption growth, and the population aging is subtracting 0.35 to 0.4, and the swing between the two then is about 1% per year difference. Again, it's enough to be very noticeable if you're not in a period of rapid economic growth from other causes. Now, this is showing changes in support ratio, the average rate of change in support ratio between 2010 and 2050. The countries down here are countries that are going to be experiencing very serious population aging in the next 40 years. So, and the green ones are Asia. So this most rapid economic consequence of aging is in Taiwan, where it's they will be losing about 0.8% per year of consumption growth because of the aging of their population. And here we have some European countries, Slovenia, Spain, here is South Korea, here's Germany, here's Japan, Hungary, China, and so on. So these are all countries that are going to be experiencing really serious population aging. Here's the US. We're kind of in the middle of the pack. It's not such a big deal, really, probably for us. But here's Latin America. All the Latin American countries are clustered here close to zero. Why are they close to zero? Well, I think it's because this time slot from 2010 to 2050 includes both a period of increase and a period of decrease, and they're kind of canceling out in the average. So here's Brazil. It's not going to be nothing, but the age distribution changes are first beneficial and then deleterious. And then here we have countries which will be benefiting from the first dividend over the next 40 years. And this would also include other African countries and so on. Okay, so that's just a quick overview of changes in the support ratio. Other things equal, population aging is going to be leading to substantial decline in consumption relative to current levels. But will other things be equal? That's what I want to come to now. Under the general heading of what we call second demographic dividend, these same forces that lead to the deteriorating support ratios can also lead to a higher level of investment in human capital and in physical capital, and that higher investment then may bring substantial economic advantages. This outcome is going to depend partly on how old age is funded in each country, what the particular institutions are, so we're going to look at that also. Let's start by looking at human capital investment. The main cause of population aging isn't lower mortality and longer life. The main cause is low fertility compared to the higher fertility before the transition. And low fertility, we have reason to think, is generally associated with higher investment in human capital per child. This is the quantity-quality theory in economics due to Becker and Willis and others. So the causal direction could be that rising income leads people to want to invest more in human capital and have fewer kids. That's one possibility. Or it could be that as returns to education rise in the labor market, and perhaps the price of education may decline because of better transportation networks and so on, parents may choose to substitute quality for quantity. Or it may be that independent decline in fertility for other reasons then makes investment in quality cheaper and parents do more of it. We don't know exactly what the causal direction is, but it doesn't matter. What matters is that as fertility declines, investment in human capital per child rises. So we measure human capital in NTA by looking at the expenditures, private and public, on education by each single year of age for children, from ages from 0 to 26. We add those all up, and we get a kind of synthetic cohort measure of investment in human capital of children. And then we standardize, again, by dividing by average labor income. And so we're going to get results in units of years of labor income invested in the human capital of each child. Here is what we see when we put all our NTA countries for which we have data together. So on this axis, we have the total fertility rate for the 5 years preceding the NTA data collection year. So this is the measure of fertility, and on this axis we have the measure of human capital investment expressed as a percent of years of labor income. So, for example, we see that in a country with a total fertility rate of 1, we would have between 5 and 6 years of labor income invested in the human capital of each child. In a country with a total fertility rate of 5 or 6, we would have maybe 1.5 years of labor income invested in the human capital of each child. And as we move through the fertility transition and move from right to left on this axis, the idea is we will be, at the same time, investing more and more in each child's human capital, mainly in education. Regionally, we have sub-Saharan Africa down here. We have Southeast Asia and South Asia in these blue dots: Thailand, Indonesia, India, and the Philippines. Here we have the Latin American countries, 5 of them, all grouped together with very similar fertility and similar levels of investment in children's human capital. These light green are European and the US, rich industrial countries, and then the East Asian countries are in the darker green, Japan, Taiwan, Korea, and China. So that's that pattern. Now, you might look at this and think, well, this is dominated by regional differences, and as fertility declines, a country isn't going to change regions, so maybe this is overstating the effect of fertility on the relationship between fertility and human capital investment. So it's useful to look at in one country over time also. And that's what we, Andy and I, have done here. So within Taiwan, we have this relationship over time. Within Japan, we have this relationship. Within the United States, we have this relationship. So over time within a country, we find a very similar relationship to what we find cross-sectionally between countries. Okay, so that's the human capital side. And now let me move to the physical capital side investment in assets. So we're first going to talk about transfers, because transfers are an alternative to supporting retirement years through assets. So we measure transfers in NTA within households where they're the difference between income received by an individual from all sources, labor, income, assets, or public transfers, and the level of consumption. If they're consuming more than all the sources of income they've received, then on net they're receiving a transfer from within the household. Say a child is receiving a transfer from his parents. So that's how we measure intra-household transfers, and then inter-household transfers, transfers between households, we measure from surveys, or direct survey questions. And currently, we're not, in most cases, able to include bequests at death, inheritances. We're working on including these now, but those will not be included in the data I show. Okay, so here is an example. We have the United States, and I'm showing the life cycle deficit here. So here we have age from 0 to 90. Here we have, well, everything is divided as usual by average labor income. And the lime green are public transfers. This purplish color is private transfers, and the red is assets. We call it asset-based reallocations. I'll come back to the assets in a moment. But if we look at children in the United States, we see that roughly 50-50, they're supported by private transfers and public transfers. You see a big jump when kids become old enough to start regular public school. Okay. And then here, during the prime working years, we see a negative value on the public transfers. That is people paying taxes that support these transfers. And then in old age again, we see people receiving and consuming public transfers. So this is partly pensions, but it's also health care that is received. And then you see this big jump at the last years. That's long-term care, nursing home care for people, particularly in their 80s and presumably 90s. Private transfers are this purplish color. We see working age population making private transfers. Mainly they're supporting their children. But perhaps more surprising, we see that the elderly are also, they have a negative value here. On net, they are also making transfers, both to their children and to their grandchildren. And this turns out to be completely typical in many countries around the world. And then we have the asset-based reallocations, the red. Now this is the difference at each age between asset income received and savings. So if you save less than the asset income you receive, then you are consuming the difference. You're consuming some of the asset income. And that's what the red is showing. And so we see that in the US, elderly people are consuming a lot of asset income. You can see, in fact, that in the US, asset income is more important than public sector transfers for supporting the elderly. Well, the US stands out among the rich industrial countries for having the greatest reliance on asset income to support consumption of the elderly. Now, I'm going to look at a lot of countries, and just at this period, this age from 65, age 65 and above. And we'll look at to what extent people are relying on public transfers, to what extent on assets, and to what extent on private transfers to support their consumption in old age. And I'm going to use a triangle diagram, and in fact, first we're going to also include labor income, to what extent they continue working. So people may, what we're going to look at first, they may continue to work, they may rely on assets, or they may rely on transfers, whether they're private or public. And that's what we see in this triangle diagram. We have assets at this vertex, labor income here, and transfers here. If the elderly in some country relied entirely on asset income, then that country would be located at this apex. If they relied entirely on labor income, they'd be here. And if they rely entirely on transfers, public or private, they're down here. And you see there's no country where the elderly rely primarily on assets. Well, entirely on assets. There's no country where the elderly rely entirely on continuing to work. But there are many countries where they rely quite strongly on transfers to support them. And so here we have Sweden, Hungary, Austria, Slovenia. Those are all, of course, European countries. Taiwan is here. Chile is here. Denmark, Brazil is here. High reliance on transfers. And you can also see that when people are relying mainly on transfers, they tend to be relying almost zero on labor income. They leave the labor force. When people are living partly on asset income and partly on labor income, they tend to be working and providing maybe a third of their consumption needs through continuing labor income, as in Indonesia or the Philippines or Mexico. Okay, so now, let's see, I think I have, so these are Latin American countries. I don't know why Mexico is so small, but you can see that they're scattered across this range, and they pretty much conform to the generalization. Now I'm going to leave labor market, labor income out of the picture, and look at another triangle that has assets, and then it has public transfers and private transfers. So let's go to that. This may be too small for you to see, but I'll highlight important points. So again, assets, public transfers, private transfers. So labor income is out of the picture. And now we see that, so this is the life cycle deficit we're looking at. Now we see there are countries that rely primarily on assets, such as the Philippines and India and Mexico. But let's start by countries relying primarily on public sector transfers in old age. So again, we have Slovenia, Austria, Hungary, Sweden, but we also have Brazil here, relying actually more than 100%. This is the 1994 data for Brazil. The elderly are getting more than 100% of their consumption costs from public sector transfers. We'll come back to that in a moment. So, and we can see that there are many more countries here relying quite heavily on public sector transfers. In very few countries do the elderly rely on transfers from their family. This was a big surprise to us. And of course it may still, we don't yet have results for Africa, we don't know what that will look like. But it's only in some East Asian countries, plus Thailand, where we see substantial reliance on families for old age support. Korea, China, Taiwan. Now, we also see that there are a lot of countries here to the right of this side of the triangle. They're farthest from the family transfer vertex. These are countries in which the elderly, on net, are making transfers to younger family members instead of receiving them. And, well, I would say the majority of the countries in NTA are in this category. The elderly are making transfers to others. So India, Mexico, US, Spain, Germany, Indonesia, and so on and so forth. And then we see many other countries that are very close to this line, at close to zero, like Philippines, Japan here, East Asian country, where the family support tradition has just changed as the economy has developed and become rich. Costa Rica, Chile. And let me point out Brazil here, which is very important, obscured, but this is Brazil. Brazil, of all the NTA countries, makes the biggest private transfers from the elderly to younger generations, or it did in 1994. And Brazil, among all the NTA countries, the elderly receive larger public sector transfers than in any other country relative to labor income. And so it's hard to avoid the conclusion, I think, that these two facts are interrelated, and it is the great generosity of public transfers to the elderly in Brazil that then lies behind the great generosity of private transfers from the elderly to younger family members.